So here we came together to do a presentation on the health consequences of climate change, as well as the health benefits of climate solutions by Stanford Climate and Health and SF Bay Physicians for Social Responsibility, and of course Sierra Club. Here we are. So thank you so much everyone for being here today. And I know we have some amazing people who are going to present on these really important topics. So I think we can just jump right into it.
So one of the reasons why we wanted to speak with you is because research has shown that providing information about the health consequences of climate change can increase climate change issue engagement and support for mitigation policies. So our hope for the takeaway of this presentation is that we will be able to share with you some teaching points that you can use when advocating for climate change solutions and when working with your communities. So some of the most compelling types of health impacts are on poor air quality, foodborne disease, extreme weather, waterborne disease, vector-borne disease, hunger and malnutrition, mental health, and extreme heat. In November 2009, The Lancet and the University College of London released a report about the health impacts of climate change in future decades, along with some solutions that can be implemented in the short and medium terms to mitigate these impacts. This report called climate change the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. They say the impacts will be felt all around the world and not just in some distant future, but in our lifetimes and those of our children. They examined in this paper the most serious direct and indirect consequences of climate change, including changing patterns of disease, water and food insecurity, vulnerable shelter and human settlements, extreme climate events, and population migration. And we chose on this slide to emphasize how we ourselves in the past 3 to 5 years can already name some of these events, such as the wildfires we've all lived through, the heat waves that they experienced in Oregon and Northern California, which also contributed to those wildfires, the flooding that we've seen in southeastern United States, and the fact in the Northeast, we're seeing higher rates of West Nile virus, leading to serious brain inflammation due to changes in mosquito patterns. So before we get into the health effects of climate change, I want to first provide a bit of context about its causes. One of the fundamental reasons is that our current economic and social system sees some people and communities as expendable and label them as, quote, sacrifice zones. These sacrifice zones exist everywhere, from the Appalachian Mountains where coal miners sacrifice their health and their ecosystem to extract coal, to the Richmond petroleum refineries, which pollute the air of the surrounding community, which includes more than 80% people of color. As Hop Hopkins, Director of Organizational Transformation at the Sierra Club, says, you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism. As such, one of the fundamental issues underlying climate change is racism and all forms of prejudice and discrimination that allows for the creation of sacrifice zones. The root cause of climate change are the systems that certain humans have created, like capitalism, colonialism, racism, and patriarchy. There are many communities in the world, like the many indigenous people and nations here in the United States or otherwise known as North America is known, Turtle Island, that believe in the idea that we must think 7 generations in advance when making decisions today so that we can ensure a sustainable future for the next generations to follow. The United States is 4% of the world's population, and yet we produce 25% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. The cruel irony of climate change is, however, that the communities and countries least responsible for climate change, as seen on these maps when looking at fossil fuel consumption, are often also the ones that bear the brunt of its effects. This is a theme we will see throughout the rest of this presentation. So how does climate change affect health? There are direct physical and mental health impacts, which include changes in fitness and activity level, in part due to air pollution and heat-related illness, as well as allergies. And you also see increased exposure to waterborne and vector-borne illness. There are mental health impacts, such as stress, anxiety, depression, grief, sense of loss, strains on social relationships, substance abuse, increased rates of PTSD, and we also see effects on community health, leading to increased interpersonal aggression, increased violence and crime, increased social instability, and decreased community cohesion. In addition to these direct impacts, there are also indirect impacts, like we see with economic effects, distribution to food supplies, overwhelming community infrastructures, and forced migrations and regional conflicts. And as we will also touch later tonight, we also see ripples of the cause and effects of climate change when it comes to geopolitical conflicts like in Syria, and also with the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. As Russia is one of the major fossil fuel producers of the global market, some researchers posit that because they saw, or because Ukraine is known for being a massive breadbasket for the world, and was also recently chosen to be a major player in the EU supply chains for materials needed for decarbonization and digitalization, Russia saw that by invading Ukraine, they could control more of the world's food supplies, which are affected acutely by climate change, as well as stop efforts in the EU to decarbonize, which would increase their power as a major fossil fuel supplier for the world's energy. So there is a connection between the redlining practice, which was established in 1933 as a racist mortgage policy in which the FHA would not secure loans in neighborhoods that were deemed as dangerous to lend to. And they had a scale for redlining, with 1 being the most desirable and 5 being the least desirable. And so what we see now is that red line neighborhoods are associated with reduced present day green space, as well as denser populations and buildings where that are not structured well without proper weatherization, meaning the windows don't seal, which lets in more air pollution and which leads to more pulmonary disease. And so part of the heat island effect is that we see the surface absorbing more heat, which means that there's less ground storage of rainfall, less cooling from evaporation and plant transpiration. And then we also see in rural areas, because this affects both rural and urban, this similar surface area absorbing less heat, less ground storage of rainfall, and unlike in urban areas, we see greater ground storage of rainfall and greater cooling from evaporation and plant transpiration. And when we look specifically in the East Bay and Oakland, NPR showed that you can clearly map regions that were redlined to regions that have a lower surface temperature. And you can also see that that corresponds to income as well. So that places with higher income in Oakland are cooler, and areas that are poor, which are in part because of the historical racist practices the United States government employed, and now have less money and financial opportunities and increased heat. And this is such an important thing to note because heat has a huge impact on physical health. Heat can lead to syncope, which is diminished blood flow to the brain, and fainting. It can lead to heat cramps, which are excessive sweating resulting in muscle cramps or spasms. Heat exhaustion, which is when the body core temperature increases, which leads to decreased cardiac output or blood that can pump through the circulation. Heat injury, leading to kidney and liver damage. Rhabdomyolysis, which is when the muscle breaks down. Disseminated intravascular coagulation, which is when the blood in your body, it clots as much as it can, and then because it actually uses up all the materials to clot, then it can't clot anymore, and then you have massive internal bleeding. Increased core body temperature, mental health problems, as I've noted before. It can also lead to heat stroke, which is a medical emergency, as many of these are, in which the body can no longer regulate its core temperature, and this leads to a delay in care increases, which leads to risk of death.
All right, now we're gonna talk about the effects of heat on the nervous system. In general, when you're exposed to too much heat, you will have a heat stroke, which can be a cause of seizures. And this potentially fatal condition is observed when the core body temperature passes the 41.1 degrees Celsius threshold, which can also be known as hyperthermia. Hence, environmental heat exposure can cause various issues on the brain, including loss of consciousness, seizures, violent muscle contractions, long-term neurological dysfunction, increased dementia-related hospitalizations in the elderly population, which is one of the most susceptible populations to this complication. And also in the first trimester, maternal hyperthermia and high fever can result in congenital abnormalities in the brain and the face region of the fetus. And congenital abnormalities is basically defined as structural or functional abnormalities that can occur during intrauterine life. And on the figure on the right side, you can observe changes on the MRI scan of a patient 4 days after heat stroke, which is on the left one. And on the right side, you can see it 14 days later. And basically what these show are hyperintensities in the brain function, which is very off from normal brain function. And you see swelling, which is basically inflammation in the brain function in different regions, especially the cortex. And in other studies, it has also been shown that physical labor, such as construction, working under hot environmental conditions, has resulted in loss of consciousness and also seizures, each lasting several minutes. Next slide, please. So increasing ambient temperatures is likely to increase rates of aggressive and criminal behavior, which may lead to increased rates of physical assaults and homicides, as well as an increase in suicide rates, especially among men and older adults. And heat also suppresses functions such as thyroid hormones, resulting in functional hypothyroidism, which may be manifested as lethargy, low mood, or just cognitive impairment in general. And the body dehydration that occurs with the heat stress can also produce significant deterioration in the brain functioning. And psychotropic and other medications can impair temperature homeostasis. And homeostasis is just a baseline normal functioning of the body. And this can furthermore lead to cognitive impairments, and especially other risk factors include people with pre-existing mental health problems. And these periodic and episodic heat waves are known to exacerbate underlying mental illnesses and behavioral disorders as well. Next slide, please. There's did you have a comment that you want to?
No, somebody asked if, I think Julie said that she had heard that murder rates were highest at 92-degree temperature. She meant ambient temperature. I think you were talking about body core temperature.
Mm-hmm.
When you were,
yeah. So poor air quality is directly tied to respiratory disease, asthma, and allergies. And we can see that wildfires are caused in part due to poor air quality and cause poor air quality, releasing dangerous particulates. In 2018, California wildfires resulted in 101 deaths. It was a record for poor air quality. And we also see longer pollen seasons with higher counts, and higher temperatures lead to higher ground levels of ozone, which lead to increased respiratory mortality. And mold and mildew in houses after flooding also irritates the airways and is related to worsening asthma. So in general, poor air quality leads to high morbidity. Next slide, please. So the air quality index is a yardstick that runs from 0 to 500, and the higher the air quality index value, the greater the level of air pollution and greater the health concern. However, one thing we want to emphasize here is the fact that there is no safe level of PM 2.5 or particulate matter 2.5, because even though the scale, the air quality index, has a label that is green, which means air quality is quote unquote good, we don't know even if we see a minimum value of 0 to 50, we don't know if that level can still hurt you or not. So even though we say it is good, there is no known safe level of PM 2.5. And the air quality index takes into account ground level ozone, as I said, PM 2.5 and PM 10, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide. Next slide. So particle pollution directly related to what I was talking about with particulate matter. Particle pollution refers to a mix of tiny solid and liquid particles that are in the air we breathe. Many of the particles are so small as to be invisible, but when levels are high, the air becomes opaque. Nothing about particle pollution is simple. In fact, it is so dangerous that it can shorten your life. You might have noticed that I mentioned both PM 2.5 and PM 10, and this refers to the size of the particulates. So PM 2.5 relates to combustion particles, organic compounds, and metals, and PM 10 is for things the size of dust, pollen, and mold. Next slide, please. Furthermore, when it comes to air pollution, we see smog or ozone, which relates to corrosive air pollution that can irritate the nose, throat, and lungs, that can lead people to cause cough, difficulty breathing. It's almost like a very bad sunburn from the inside. And so warmer conditions cause formation of ground level ozone or smog, and the way that we make ozone or smog is through the addition of nitrous oxides and volatile compounds. Nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds are produced primarily when fossil fuels like gasoline, oil, or coal are burned, or when some chemicals like solvents evaporate. Nitrogen oxides is the generic term, and they are most relevant for air pollution, namely nitric oxide and nitrogen dioxide. These gases contribute to the formation of smog and acid rain, as well as affecting the tropospheric ozone. Nitrogen oxides are commonly emitted from power plants, motor vehicles, and other sources of high heat combustion. And volatile organic compounds are emitted from motor vehicles as well, chemical plants, refineries, factories, gas stations, paint, and other sources. And so what we see is that, and what it has been reported on in recent studies, is that historical redlining is associated with present day air pollution disparities, which means we're seeing more PM 2.5 and more PM 10. And short-term exposure to PM 10 leads to worsening of asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, increased hospitalization and emergency department visits, and long-term exposure to PM 2.5s cause premature death, especially for people with chronic heart or lung diseases, reduced lung function growth in children. And so this historic racism has consequences today on folks today are in our communities of color, and is affecting their children and their elders. Next slide, please. And we can see that one of our partners who has long time advocated for this, Ms. Margaret Gordon of the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, has worked really hard advocating for her community, which she has firsthand seen be affected by redlining policies, and is now has to deal with the effects of air pollution killing and harming members of her community. And the picture on the right is also just to evoke the fact that because these communities faced lower rates of investment because of government policies, it was easier then for the government to buy back that land because it was so cheap and build interstate highways. So not only was it the land cheap in the first place and designated as dangerous to lend to because it was already on the sites that were polluted at the time in the 1930s, then because it was cheap in the first place, it became cheaper to pollute. And so these communities have just faced the cyclical brunt that directly affects their health and their well-being. Next slide. So there are many health harms of fossil fuels. These lead to poor birth outcomes, which include premature birth, low birth weight, being small for gestational age. They are the leading source of harmful air pollutants. They lead to lung diseases, as I've mentioned, such as asthma. They increase the risk of heart disease and death. They can cause cancer. They are harmful to reproductive health and neurological development, and they can lead to neurological sequelae such as dementia and depression. And the CalGEM Public Health Rulemaking Scientific Advisory Panel created this nice little organizational chart where we can conceptualize the different mitigation strategies that we can take to protect communities against fossil fuels. So at the top, as most protective, we can see reducing and eliminating new and existing oil and gas wells, followed by setbacks for new and existing wells, followed by engineering controls, followed by residence controls, and lastly is PPE, which is the least protective. And I think it's interesting that we see PPE as a frontline strategy right now, but a lot in the media, but that's not what's most important to be. That's not the thing that can make the biggest change and impact in our communities. It really is starting at the top and reducing or eliminating new and existing oil and gas wells, which is calling big organizations to task, and we need to realize that it's less so the onus of the individual and the onus of the people who have been affected by these racist policies. It is the onus really is on those who perpetuate those racist policies and perpetuate health harms and perpetuate pollution. Next slide, please.
Okay, so as mentioned earlier, air pollution contains particulate matters, but also you can see ultrafine particles, which are smaller than 0.1 micrometers in diameter. And these can travel through the olfactory nerve as seen on the picture on the right side. And they can directly bypass the blood-brain barrier through the blood and enter the brain. And the blood-brain barrier is a specialized system of brain cells that shields the brain from toxic substances in the blood and supplies brain tissues with nutrients and filters harmful compounds from entering the brain. So as you could imagine, these particles that bypass this very important barrier can have very negative side effects on the brain health. And inflammatory responses in major regions of the brain can also be seen as a result of exposure to air pollution. And the higher risk of cognitive decline and dementia can be seen as a result of such exposures. And you can also see poor neurological development in children, which thereby leads to poor birth outcomes. And this is not only seen in humans, in animal models and studies, similar results have been seen. For example, poor performance in learning and memory problems, and also behaviors resembling human anxiety, depression, and impulsiveness were seen in animal studies as well. And multiple environmental contaminants have a neurotoxic effect on the brain. For example, wildfires can burn pesticides, which can then enter our ecosystem and have a cascade of negative effects on our health. And just to give you an example, a study in Canada found that the risk of dementia increased the closer people live to these environments, and also, for example, roadways that are closer in proximity to regions that more cars and fossil fuels are released into the environment. Next slide, please. Also, air pollution can have an effect on Alzheimer's disease, and Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia affecting millions of people worldwide, and it will continue to affect millions more within the coming years, and especially since the aging population is on the rise worldwide. And one important fact about Alzheimer's disease is that it's multifactorial, which means that there are many different things that can lead to and worsen this condition. For example, genetic predisposition, as you can see on the picture, age, and also sex, whether you're male or female, and also, as mentioned earlier, air pollution and brain barrier disruption is a very common theme in these sort of neurological complications. And air pollution in general activates these various responses or pathways in the brain, which tend to lead to swelling or inflammation of the tissues of the brain. And it can also lead to oxidative stress, which is an imbalance between free radicals and antioxidants in your body. And antioxidants, as you might have heard, they're very important in terms of tissue health in your body, not only the brain, other organs as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so climate change can also have negative effects on infectious diseases and their prevalence. And on the right, you see the picture of Aedes aegypti, which is a mosquito, one of the vectors of infectious diseases, including dengue, yellow fever, Zika, and chikungunya. And with climate change and warming temperatures, we're seeing increased geographical range distribution, and the risk of these vector-borne diseases are increasing. And that is because of the physiology of these mosquitoes. They're more likely to reproduce and feed more frequently in higher temperatures. And we see that temperature elevation is increasing up north and in areas that we haven't seen before. And for example, with Aedes aegypti, we're now seeing it in California, and these mosquitoes are non-native to our state. And these are gonna lead to various complications. On top of that, waterborne illnesses due to flooding, societal disruption can also be seen, such as cholera. And these are again due to increased temperature. Rainfall variability is a big one, and the whole altered dynamics of species that can transmit these from themselves to humans or vice versa. They're called zoonotic diseases. Next slide, please. And one of the other type of infectious diseases, which is passed on by another vector called the Anopheles mosquito, is malaria. And cerebral malaria is actually the worst subtype of malaria, which can have like huge negative effects on the brain and neurological issues, including neurological deficits, epilepsy, cognitive impairments, aggressive behavior, and so on. And especially in a study, they looked at a younger population, younger adults can be more, this case can be more observed in that subset of population. And other vectors such as ticks can lead to neurological complications as well. And on the image on the right side, you're looking at a picture of algal blooms. And these blooms have neurotoxins in them, and they can lead to, again, a lot of neurological complications and brain issues in people, regardless of your age. And in general, for example, another sort of contaminant in the food chain is the seafood. And on top of these neurotoxins, you can have things like mercury, which can bioaccumulate and pass on to higher levels of the food web, which you can see worse symptoms seen in humans. Next slide, please. And this image basically summarizes the direct and indirect effects of climate change. So we already talked about rising temperatures, extreme temperatures, altered rainfall, and just extreme weather events. And the direct effects we're seeing is rising ocean levels, ocean acidification, flooding, drought, wildfires, especially in California. And indirect impacts could be just air, soil pollution, and water pollution, environmental degradation, changes in the ecology, which is not only impacts us, but also other animals, including plants as well. And also it damages and undermines our food security and food production as well, which can then lead to migration and civil conflicts and injuries as well. And as we said, These can lead to brain diseases, including infectious diseases, neurotoxins, malnutrition, and just stress in general. Next slide, please.
Yes, thank you, Hussein. So with that, we want to talk a little bit about the climate crisis effects specifically on food and water. And we have this diagram up here from the US Climate Resilience Toolkit. And just to briefly reiterate, some of the consequences of the climate crisis includes higher water temperatures, heavier downpours, more flooding, sea levels, and ground level rise. And in the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about the diseases and especially specifically like other consequences that arise due to the higher water temperatures, the heavier downpours. But before we do that, I want to draw some attention to the diagram right here. So in the first diagram, it shows a little bit of how temperature and precipitation extremes like flooding can increase pathogen load. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But climate can also alter like the weed, insect, and the populations and increase pesticide use. And then it kind of like shows how this increases rising carbon dioxide, especially in our atmosphere, and then can directly influence like the content of our food, especially the like everyday food that we consume. And then warmer temperatures can result in greater food spoilage, as well as extreme climate events can disrupt the food distribution overall. So very similar to like natural cycles that we see all the time, like water, nitrogen, et cetera. Like this is a cycle itself because due to the fact that a lot of these natural processes like all depend and influence each other, similarly, the climate crisis will disrupt these cycles and therefore have greater impact rather than just like flood, let's say a farmhouse, but no, it would also greatly influence the food. But yeah, higher water temperatures, greater rains, and more flooding are all contributing to the spread of bacteria, viruses, and parasites from animal and human waste in agricultural areas. So on the next slide, please, we're going to talk a little bit about what exactly these pathogens and diseases that are food and waterborne look like. So yeah, here are a depiction of the fecal oral route that I will talk a little bit about. But before that, I wanted to reiterate that climate change has the potential to increase food and water safety concerns in a variety of different ways. So infections caused by bacteria like Salmonella, for example, are more likely when temperatures are higher. Rapid, strong rainfall events that we talked a little bit about in the previous slide can also generate periodic spikes in stream flow rates, which have been associated to increase these waterborne diseases, as well as changes in the overall water treatment. And climate change is actually projected to increase the danger of waterborne sickness enclosures in like nearby lakes and water bays. And food and contamination and foodborne disease are also further exacerbated by the climate extremes, particularly severe precipitation and flooding. And then these extremes can alter the amount of pollutants and chemical residues that crops and livestock are exposed to. But yeah, and before we move on to the next slide, I do want to draw attention to the fecal oral route right here. And this diagram kind of depicts of how, again, it's a never-ending cycle that intersects in so many different ways. So feces of an infected person can result to not only, contaminate waste, but also influence different animals, specifically like flies, or contaminate fluids, our fingers, etc., and then ultimately end up either in our foods or in contact with other people, and then further target a new host. And I know it is a pretty disgusting reality, but it is a true one that we do have to live and kind of acknowledge every single day. And it is one that is further exacerbated because of the climate crisis. Next slide. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the One Health approach. So One Health is an approach that acknowledges that human health is intertwined to the health of animals and our shared environment. One Health isn't necessarily a new concept. It's gained a lot of traction in the recent years, published by the CDC. This is because a variety of reasons have altered how people, animals, plants, and our environment interact each and every day. Human populations are increasing and spreading into new locations, and as a result of this, more people are interacting with everything around them, including wild, domestic animals, livestock, pets, etc. Therefore, because of these like vital interactions, animals have a variety of ways also interacting with everyday things that we interact with, including food, fiber, livelihoods, travel, education. And then the closer these interactions get with our environments and the animals within them, it increases the chances of disease transmission between animals and humans. And yeah, and then also we talked a little bit how humans are intersected with their environment, and climate and land use changes such as deforestation and intensive farming methods have occurred throughout the planet, and changes in our environment and habitats create these new opportunities for, again, these illnesses to spread from animals. And then recently we've seen a lot of travel and trade really depicting like the influence of how easily a pandemic or like a specific disease can spread around the world. And international trade and travel have also intersected with how like animal spreading diseases can also take place and affect different countries around the world. They've boosted the mobility of people, animals, and animal products. This does have a lot of advantages in our today's everyday economy, but they also have our disadvantages because diseases can quickly spread across national borders and around the world within days. But yeah, and then there are definitely a lot of zoonotic illnesses and diseases that we're familiar with. These diseases are just, again, to define diseases that are spread between animals and humans. And every year, because of these diseases, they influence and hurt millions and millions of people. But yeah, I definitely recommend for you to check out this link, as well as like visit cdc.gov/OneHealth to read more about this strategy and this idea that they've talked about, because it really shows the great intersectionality that we face with our environments and habitats. Next slide. Yes, and with that, we're going to move into a little bit about the health effects due to extreme weather events. Hossein and India have touched on it a little bit, but I want to kind of depict some of and go bullet point by bullet point of some of the disasters caused by extreme weather events. So flooding, again, an extreme consequence that induces like pathogens and infectious diseases. Droughts, hurricanes, they lead to direct injuries and deaths, but they also lead to contaminated water supplies and increased risk of infectious diseases, as we just talked about. And what I will talk about the long-term psychological effects that also are a consequence due to these extreme weather events. And then a huge displacement of climate migrants. This is a very significant and increasingly important topic that needs to be discussed about more, because due to the fact that we have this very short time period to act, people are already being like faced on the front lines of due to the extreme weather events, and they are already facing extreme displacement from their own communities, whether they're migrating towards inwards, like through other parts of their country, or leaving their country altogether. It is an extremely important issue that is definitely looked past, especially in like policy work today. And then we have kind of like a depiction of the extreme financial losses due to extreme weather events. I think it's very hard for people to really understand the magnitude of how much money is lost, not only in like the period where the hurricane or drought or any extreme weather event has hit a community, but the afterwards of rebuilding that community is definitely something that is sometimes ignored in media. And that is usually like a huge significant part of the financial losses that communities face. And we have some of the money losses depicted here on the screen. Like, for example, Hurricane Harvey cost $180 billion to the communities that are affected. And again, this is due to a lot of the community rebuilding work that has to happen for people that face complete destruction of their communities. But yeah, and with that, I do want to emphasize that not only are they like financial losses, but there are an increased respiratory cardiovascular disease injuries and premature deaths from extreme weather events, because the changes in the prevalence and the geographic distribution of food and waterborne illnesses and other infectious diseases are all threats to everyday lives of everyday people. Next slide. And we want to talk a little bit about what it looks like on a geopolitical scale. So how does it look like when a whole country or even a region face a consequence that really affects its people and communities in more than just one place? And I want to look forward into Syria specifically as a case study. But before we do that, I do want to highlight that other countries and other regions around the world face lost land due to droughts, regional conflicts, the climate conflict is a huge one that faces like that presents a lot of political disagreements, displaced farmers, climate migrants, and Syria is a very, very interesting case that you can really look at to examine all of these things playing together, unfortunately. Due to a drought they faced between 2006 and 2011, it destroyed about 60% of Syria's landmass, wiping out the livelihoods of over 800,000 Syrian farmers and herders, just because of this drought that really displaced all of these people. And then in addition to that, it really, really harmed their land for generations that is being I guess, unable to be used furthermore due to like the irrigation and grain production. But yeah, and this is also something that is a huge conversation and within itself can be a presentation about how Syria's drought led to all of these different conflicts taking place within one area. And I think it's very important to look at, especially for the future of other countries that are already on the front line of the climate crisis today, that will definitely face a lot of very similar circumstances that Syria had faced. Next slide. And with that, I do want to highlight something that is definitely heavy for a lot of people, and that is the environmental anxiety or eco-distress that arises from thinking about the climate crisis, as well as arises for people who are facing the climate crisis already. Environmental anxiety does not affect everyone in the same way. In reality, it's more common among those who are concerned about environmental protection. And then we have a little bit of symptoms listed on the screen, but mild anxiety, tension, sleep difficulties, anxiousness, and so on are just a few symptoms that may lead to eco-anxiety being a very prevalent health issue for so many people. And eco-anxiety can lead to a feeling of suffocation or even sadness in the most severe cases. People in the latter group are more likely to feel a significant sense of remorse about the state of the earth, which can be exacerbated when thinking about the future of their children and their generation. And on the screen on the diagram, we do have a few other examples that are caused because of climate fear and climate grief. And again, I do want to point out the distinction that a lot of people do face climate fear already due to just thinking about, I guess, future generations, as well as like the potential losses they may face. And then a lot of people are also facing climate grief due to being already on the frontline community and facing these losses already. And having faced these consequences of these threats. But with that, I do want to I do want to continue this discussion first about like what can be like thought about to kind of combat these eco-distress syndromes, as well as the overall fear of the climate crisis. So next slide, please. Okay, and this slide is a very interesting one where it talks about the antidote to anxiety is action. And as important as it is to talk a lot about the fears that we are facing, as well as the threats and the consequences, it is important to emphasize this very, very dire need for action. And this action isn't necessarily just an individual initiative. It is a whole responsibility of not only the family, but the community, institution, and the overall structural government. In order to really combat these fears and threats that communities and frontline communities have been facing for many years and many centuries even, we need to really emphasize the need for consumer-based action, including, but not limited to, diets, divestment, decreased fossil fuel-based travel, increased building efficiency, and there's much, much more. But the most important understanding to take away is that whatever you do, that you shouldn't really think it falls just solely on your shoulders alone, but rather it is a community and global initiative that needs to really be targeted in order to move past this anxiety and turn it into action. But yes, and then next slide, please. So with that, we want to end on the point of a similar one that we started with and India talked about, and it's this the most compelling solution. So the Journal of the Climate Change and Health emphasized again that people feel more like incentivized to act when they realize that the climate crisis is directly intersected with health. And they provided a lot of these compelling solutions that people feel very entailed to act on and are interested in. And I want to go over some of them right now. So energy, it was ranked #1, and this is solely meaning like using cleaner forms of energy such as solar and wind power in homes, schools, communities, in order to really reduce the pollution that's already faced due to the climate crisis. And then other points as well are cities and communities. So sustainable designs, not only buildings, but increasing green spaces around us. Green spaces have been proven in scientific journals to improve mental health, making it easier for people to transport around their communities. That's a huge thing that a lot of lobbyists and policy advocates for the climate crisis are advocating for here within the US especially. And that's a bigger transportation mass transit system for us to be able to utilize in such a huge country. Consumption can mean anything within our everyday lives, whether it be at home, work, schools, factories, communities. And this can be as little and as big as you want it to be. And whether it be food, water, anything that can save energy, reduce waste, and reduce the pollution that causes climate change is all encompassed in the consumption. And then natural spaces, we kind of touched upon this of how natural spaces fit in the cities and communities narrative, but really recognizing that natural spaces on its own is very, very important as we move towards a more sustainable and equitable future. And that's restoring a lot of these damaged lands around us and giving space for clean air and clean water to just naturally be. And transportation, again, is something we talked a little bit about in how they can fit in cities and communities, but ensuring that transportation isn't only clean, but it's also equitable, because at times, like, we fail to forget how different, like, sustainable, I guess, initiatives can be over-encompassing and how they can be more equitable towards everyone. And then buildings, food, and control are some of the other solutions that they've ranked, and they all encompass, again, encouraging sustainable buildings, encouraging sustainable and local organic farming, and reducing all of the waste, whether it be the building waste or the food waste. But yeah, and then we have our last slide. And the last slide just reiterates that the most compelling message combination, as presented in the journal, first described the negative impacts of climate change on air quality, then explained how this transition to clean energy will benefit people's health, and then ended with explaining how most Americans support the solution and many are taking action to advocate for it. So with that, we want to emphasize that, of course, it's really important to always emphasize the consequences and the threats that we face by the climate crisis, but it's also equally important to emphasize how our everyday role can be really impactful on how we move forward towards a more sustainable and equitable future. So thank you.